Good morning, Bitcoin and Metaplanet world. My name is Aiden Gillespie, and today I will be discussing Metaplanet and the mathematical case for it to 4x in the next 60 days. Quick disclaimer, none of this is financial advice. I am not telling you to do anything. I am simply going through models that I have created myself based on math that I have done myself. None of this is a guarantee of the future that Metaplanet will do. This is simply going through my predictions based on my models and math alone. So without further ado, let's get started. Now to create my models, I largely used this chart here, which goes through Metaplanet's MNAV over time. With this chart, I can see some trends here. What I'm noticing is that the MNAV right over here starts really high. It creates like this U formation and then creates a smaller peak. And then from there, it creates another U formation, creating another small peak in MNAV. And then from there, I'm expecting it to create another U formation that is slightly smaller than the previous U formations, creating another peak that is smaller than the previous peak in MNAV. That's kind of what I'm seeing from this chart. Plus, that's just what makes sense. With this, with the market, we'll probably see some spikes and then drawdowns in MNAV. And then we'll also see it compress over time. So the peaks should be expected to be getting smaller and smaller over time. And then as MNAV is compressing, I would expect that these kind of U formations that we're seeing from peak to peak is getting smaller because that MNAV is compressing over time, and there will be a little bit less volatility over time there as MNAV is compressing. So that's my overall take on the chart for Metaplanet's MNAV over time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create models, and lots of these models are based on the different peaks that we're seeing here in MNAV. So what I'm going to try to do with the models that I'm creating is determine what that next peak is going to be in MNAV. And then from there, I'll be able to figure out a rough estimate of where Metaplanet's share price should be trading at once it hits that next peak. So for reference, the peaks that I'm using is this MNAV peak right over here on the far left of the screen. Then from what I'm seeing, I think it creates this U formation leading to this peak right over here where my mouse is. So that's the next reference point I'll be using for my models. And then from there, it creates another U formation leading to this peak right over here, which is the third reference point that I'll be using for the models. And then from there, it's going off the screen here, creating another U formation. And I'm expecting there to be another peak in MNAV, but it's not going to be as high as the previous peak in MNAV because MNAV just has to compress over time with the accretive dilution, and as Metaplanet's acquiring more Bitcoin over time, Metaplanet's MNAV has to compress over time. So I'm expecting that these peaks will get smaller over time, but I'm going to create a model on what I'm expecting that next peak to be. So here are the models that I'm creating here. The first model is my model on MNAV peaks over time. So for this, on the x-axis here, we've got the days. The y-axis, we have the MNAV. So at 107 days, their first peak was at a little over 20 for the MNAV. And then the second peak I'm using for this model is at 340 days, where the MNAV was at 12.3. And then the third peak I'm using is at 435 days, where the MNAV peak was at about a 9.3. So going back to the chart, those reference points can just be seen here at this first peak on the far left, right over here towards towards the middle of the graph here, and then right over here, that peak on the right side of the graph there. Those are the reference points I'm using to create this model. And then based on this model, I was able to create an equation for this line here, and it can be expressed as y equals 27.6 e raised to a super small number there, x. So I'll be using that equation there to help me down the road to help me calculate the share price of Metaplanet at that fourth peak that I'm expecting that the MNAV will get to. The next model that I'll be using to help me determine the share price of Metaplanet at that fourth peak is the peak number and the days. So how many days after Bitcoin adoption it took for Metaplanet to hit each peak. So the first peak was hit at 107 days. The second peak was hit at 340 days. The third peak was hit at 435 days. And then the fourth peak, that is what I want to find out. I want to figure out when that fourth peak is going to hit. And the equation for this graph can be expressed as this following equation right down here. So now I'll go into my calculations to predict the MNAV peak. So based on the first model there, this is the equation right over here that we'll be using to determine the MNAV peak after X number of days. And in this equation, Y equals the MNAV peak and X equals the days since Bitcoin adoption. However, we do not know either the MNAV peak or the days since Bitcoin adoption. So we can't really figure this out unless we know either of these variables. However, we can use Model 2 to figure out X, the days since Bitcoin adoption, because we were looking in that second model, we were looking at the days after Bitcoin adoption it would take to hit a peak in MNAV, and that could be expressed by this following equation. And the variables we're looking for is the peak number and the X days since Bitcoin adoption. Again, we don't know the days since Bitcoin adoption it will take for us to get to that fourth peak number, but we know that based on that model, we had three peaks. We are approaching that fourth peak. So Y in this equation here for Model 2 would be equal to 4. And from there, we could figure out how many days since Bitcoin adoption it would take to reach that fourth peak based on model number 2. So now let's go ahead and calculate X, the day since Bitcoin adoption. So based on Model 2, again, here's the equation for how that model can be expressed. And so what we're going to do is we're essentially going to take that next peak number that we're approaching, which we're approaching that fourth peak based on our model here. We'll plug that in for Y. So we get an equation of 4 equals 0.674 e raised to the, I won't get into that too much here, but we'll just plug in 4 for Y here. And then if you do the math, you'll get X equaling 528.3 days since Bitcoin adoption for us to be able to hit that fourth MNAV peak. So when exactly will that happen? Well, it has been 469 days since Metaplanet has adopted Bitcoin. So we'll just take 528 days minus the 469 days that have already happened since Metaplanet has adopted Bitcoin. And we get 59 days left until I'm expecting Metaplanet to reach its fourth MNAV peak. So now that we know how many days that it's going to take Metaplanet to reach its fourth MNAV peak, we'll be able to calculate what that expected MNAV number would be based on Model 1, because we will be using this number right here, the 528 days, what we calculated X for, in the equation for model number 1 to be able to calculate the expected, what the expected MNAV will be at the next MNAV peak. So let's get into that equation right over here. So based on graph number 1 here, right over here, that's the equation we'll be using. That's the equation that modeled out graph number 1 for us there. And again, Y equals the MNAV peak, what the MNAV is at the peak, and then X equals the days since Bitcoin adoption. We just calculated with the first model, or sorry, the second model, that X equaled 528 days. So it would take 528 days for us to get to the fourth peak that we're expecting in MNAV. So we'll just plug in 528 for x. So we plug that right in here for the equation. And then we get y to equal 7.57. So the MNAV I'm expecting at that next peak is 7.57. So based on these models, I'm expecting that A, it's going to take 528 days since Metaplanet's original Bitcoin adoption for that fourth peak to occur. And at that point, the MNAV would be trading at 7.57. So now let's calculate how that would affect the share price. So Metaplanet's current MNAV is trading at a 3.94. I understand that based on Metaplanet's direct website, it's actually a little bit lower. I'm using the MNAV based on strategytracker.com. Why? One, because that was the very, very first graph that I was looking at, comparing the MNAV of Metaplanet over time. Strategytracker.com typically has a slightly higher MNAV than what Metaplanet's website says the MNAV is. And then also so I want to keep this consistent based on the data points that I have already used in my models. And then also if I'm using this higher MNAV, rather than the lower MNAV on Metaplanet's website directly, it will get me a more conservative price target. And I like to aid on the side of caution and like to go a little bit more conservative there when I can. So that's why I'll use the slightly higher MNAV based on strategytracker.com, the data there. So we calculated in that previous slide that the MNAV will peak at 7.57 here for this next peak that I'm expecting here. And so this would affect the stock price by essentially dividing that MNAV peak by the current MNAV of 3.94. And then we would get a 1.92x in the stock price based on MNAV expansion alone. Now, for everyone that's going to say I'm not taking accretive dilution into account, MNAV can't expand, I understand, I know that. I am saying that MNAV right now is way lower than it should be, and that it's probably going to go up a little bit from here based on the trends that we've seen, based on those kind of U patterns that we've seen on that MNAV chart. Additionally, I am taking accretive dilution and MNAV compression into account. That is why the peak, this MNAV peak I am expecting is lower than the previous MNAV peak. That's how I modeled it out to be, with these peaks decreasing over time, because I understand that with accretive dilution, with Metaplanet acquiring more and more Bitcoin, MNAV is going to compress over time. Right now, I'm just saying that MNAV is going to grow because MNAV is at a very low point. However, the peaks in MNAV are going to get lower over time. The bottoms in MNAV are going to get lower over time. I'm just expecting that the next peak is going to be a little bit lower than the previous peak, and this next peak will trade at an MNAV of around 7.57. That is my expectation, or sorry, yeah, 7.57 peak for MNAV there. That's my expectation based on MNAV compression, based on my models that I have created. So then Metaplanet's price with a consistent or a constant Bitcoin price, not increasing or decreasing, and assuming Metaplanet buys no Bitcoin, which I do not see happening at all, this is how it would affect the stock price. So it's currently trading at $9. We would just multiply it by the multiple in the MNAV, which is 1.92, and then we would get $17.28 per share. So that's kind of how these models would affect the stock price if we just took that increase in MNAV alone. However, that MNAV growth alone probably won't happen. Metaplanet is going to increase their Bitcoin holdings. I'm going to assume that Metaplanet doubles their Bitcoin holdings in the next 59 days, which is when we're expecting that fourth peak to occur. Why I kind of think this is a good framework to happen. Well, Metaplanet consistently doubles their Bitcoin stack roughly every 46 days. Additionally, I'm expecting MNAV to go up. So as MNAV goes up, it will give the ability for Metaplanet to raise more money to be able to buy more Bitcoin. So I feel like they're going to be able to stay on track and maybe even move a little bit faster here with their acquisitions in Bitcoin because I'm expecting the MNAV to go up in the next 2 months here. Additionally, 59 days gives us to Tuesday, September 16th. We've got 9 more potential Bitcoin buy announcements. We've got one more Bitcoin buy announcement that we'll be very likely to see tomorrow here. Yeah, Metaplanet likes to announce their buys typically on Mondays, so we're gonna see several more buys by Metaplanet. I think that assuming Metaplanet doubles their Bitcoin holdings in the next 59 days, I feel like that's actually a little bit on the conservative side. I think they'll do a little bit better than that, but I like to aid on the side. I like to stay a little bit more conservative here. It is possible that they don't quite get to that number, but this is kind of what I'm expecting to happen here in the next 59 days based on my model and based on what Metaplanet has historically done. So what would happen to the price if Metaplanet doubles their Bitcoin holdings? So Metaplanet's net asset value would essentially double, assuming Bitcoin's price remains constant. So if Metaplanet's net asset value or NAV doubles and MNAV 1.92x's, then we get a 1.92x on the double in their net asset value. So we get a 3.84x in share price. So we'll take their current share price of about $9, multiply it by 3.84, and then we would get a share price of $34.56. Now, this is also assuming that Bitcoin's price remains constant. I feel like Bitcoin is going to grow here. There is the potential that we go into a bear market, but I'm not expecting that anytime super soon. I'd say if we were to go into a bear market, it would start maybe the end of October, early November, somewhere around there. But I feel like up through September 16th, Bitcoin is looking very, very bullish here still. So I'm expecting Bitcoin's price to grow. So not share price, Bitcoin's price would grow by 10%. This is going to be the number that I'm just going to use for these calculations here. So we would take that 1.92x in Metaplanet's in the MNAV multiple that we just calculated there. And then we'll multiply that by Metaplanet's net asset value growth. So if Metaplanet doubles their Bitcoin holdings and Bitcoin grows by 10%, we'll take 2 times 1.1, that 10% growth in Bitcoin, to get 2.2 there. We'll multiply that by the expansion in MNAV because I'm expecting that the MNAV will grow by 1.92x of what it's currently sitting at. So we'll multiply all that together and then we'll get a 4.22x in share price. So if we take the current share price of $9, multiply it by 4.22, we get a share price of just under $38 in the expected time frame of 59 days based on the models that I have created. Now I have created another model because back on this calculation of share price, we were looking at Metaplanet doubling its Bitcoin holdings. If we know Metaplanet is able to double their Bitcoin holdings in the next 59 days, we could actually take another look at this here and create another model to be able to calculate the share price here. And this model will end up giving a little bit of a more conservative prediction for where Metaplanet will be, but it's still going to be pretty similar to the previous models that I used. So model 3, we're essentially going to take a look at what Metaplanet's Bitcoin has been valued at when their MNAV peaks, and we'll compare that over time there since the days that they adopted Bitcoin. So essentially, what I'm saying here with this graph is that looking back at the previous models that I created, looking at those MNAV peaks, essentially what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, at this MNAV, Metaplanet had X amount of Bitcoin, so they were essentially viewed as being worth X amount of Bitcoin there. And that's kind of what I'm graphing out here. That might have been a little bit confusing, but I'll go through some calculations. So peak number one, right over here on the left part of the graph here, Metaplanet at that time had 246 Bitcoin. They were trading at an MNAV of just over 21. So they were essentially being valued at 5,195 Bitcoin. Peak number two on the graph, right over here. Metaplanet had 1,762 Bitcoin, and they were trading at a 12.23 MNAV. So they were essentially being worth 21,500 Bitcoin. And then peak number three at the far right of the graph here, Metaplanet had 10,000 Bitcoin, traded at a 9.3 MNAV. So they were essentially being worth 93,000 Bitcoin. So essentially what I did was instead of graphing this out and peaking and just graphing the MNAV and the MNAV peaks, I also took into account how much Bitcoin Metaplanet had at that time in this model here as well. And then I can use that to create another theoretical prediction here on Metaplanet's price because we're taking into the assumption that Metaplanet will double their Bitcoin holdings in the next 59 days. So based on this previous model here, this is the equation that can model this graph here. So I put that equation back on this slide right over here too. And we know that X equals 528 days since Bitcoin's adoption. That's expected when the fourth peak in MNAV is expected to be. So we could just plug that number in for X right over here. And then when we solve that, we would get 217,112 Bitcoin. So essentially, what I'm saying here with this model is I'm saying that at that next, I'm expecting MNAV to have another peak again here. At that peak, MNAV is going to be trading around like 6 to a 7 MNAV here. At that MNAV, with knowing that Metaplanet has doubled their Bitcoin holdings and with the consideration of where Metaplanet's MNAV would be trading at, Metaplanet would essentially be being valued by the market at 217,000 Bitcoin. So looking down here, if Metaplanet doubles their Bitcoin holdings to 32,704, we could take that number that we just calculated, that 217,000, divide it by 32,704 Bitcoin that we expect Metaplanet to hold at that next MNAV peak, and then we would get an MNAV of 6.64. That's pretty close to that previous MNAV that we calculated that was just over 7, but this one is a little bit more conservative. So now I'll create the calculations using this slightly more conservative MNAV here. So based on that third model here, we got that MNAV of 6.64. We'll divide it by that current MNAV of 3.94, and we get a 1.69x in MNAV. So then we're assuming that Metaplanet's Bitcoin stack doubles. So then we'll take that 1.69x in their MNAV. We'll multiply it by 2 since they've doubled their Bitcoin stack, and we get a 3.3x in share price, assuming that Bitcoin's price remains constant. So then we would take that, multiply it by their current share price of 9, and we would get a share price of $30.42. So I believe this is one of the more conservative estimates in share price based on my models here. And then we'll also take that number, assuming that Bitcoin grows by 10% in the next 59 days. And so we would take that 3.38x in share price. We would multiply it by 1.1 since we're thinking that Bitcoin grows by 10%. And we would get a 3.72x in share price. So then we would take the current share price, multiply it by that 3.72x, and we would get a share price of $33.48. So those are all my calculations based on all of the models that I have created. You can kind of find what model you like best, where you think Metaplanet's going, and you can kind of see if you kind of agree with these numbers or if you have any differences in beliefs. But here's my personal predictions and my personal strategy. So 59 days from now, it will be September 16th. I think that based on these models, based on those calculations, I'm aiming for a price target around $32 to $40. $40 Bitcoin. I think that Bitcoin's price would have to grow a little bit more than 10%. But nevertheless, I'm expecting somewhere around this price range for Metaplanet to be trading at around September 16th. Now, this could happen a little bit before September 16th. It could take a little bit longer. And then, of course, it could be a little bit outside of this range. But this is my best estimate based on my models here, that it will be trading at around $32 to $40 around September 16th. However, soon after this point, MNAV may compress again. Again, these are the calculations based on when that next peak in MNAV will be. So then after that MNAV peaks, I'm expecting that MNAV will compress back down again. It'll get a little bit lower, then it'll eventually rise up again. That next peak will be a little bit lower than this peak, so it'll be a little bit lower than that 6 to 7 MNAV that we calculated in the previous models there. So the price may fall soon after this price target has been reached. So my strategy is I'm just hodling. I am convicted that Metaplanet will be able to easily accumulate over 500,000 Bitcoin. So really, I think that $32 to $40 is nothing. And the only way to screw this up is to sell. If you just hold, I think everyone is going to be pretty happy at the end of the day. Of course, this is just my personal opinion, not financial advice again. So if my predictions do come true, though, basically my plan will be at that point to start saving up some dry powder for MNAV to compress back down, and then I will be buying much heavier if MNAV were to compress back below a 4. That's just these are just my predictions, my personal strategy, what I think will happen in Metaplanet, and my plan for accumulating more Metaplanet over time. If you have any questions, you can leave them down in the comments. Again, none of this was financial advice. These are simply my models based on my predictions and based on my math. None of this is a guarantee to happen in the future. Do your own research. And with all that said, thank you everyone for watching. If you like content like this, if you like the work that I've been putting out, please consider liking and subscribing to support the channel and to support my work.